Now we're going to experiment with a few basic techniques of watercolor. So, first thing we need to do is take our watercolor tray, and in order to prepare your paints for painting, it's a good idea to put some water on top of the paints. You can do this with your sponge by dripping. You could do it with your spray bottle by just a light spray over all of them. You can even run it under a faucet if you want to. But the reason for doing that is that it allows the paint to soften up, and then it comes more easily onto your brush. So, now, the first thing that you often want to do is put down a background color, and that in watercolor we like to usually work from light to dark. It's harder to change dark, but you can always make light darker. So I'm going to start with this color here, which is kind of a golden yellow, and in order to make a background that's fairly similar throughout, fairly consistent, I want to work kind of quickly with a fair amount of water. So you see I'm just kind of very quickly putting down some color here so that I have a background that is consistent, and it's a very light shade. You can see it's a very light shade of that yellow sort of color. With wet into dry because I have a dry background here, even though it is a color that I painted. Okay, I'm going to take my middle-sized brush, which is my number 6, and let's see what color is kind of calling my name. Maybe this nice sort of magenta color. So once I have my brush filled with paint, you know, there's a lot of paint in that brush, a fair amount of water and a lot of paint, then I can move my brush slowly across and get a line. I can add a little more water to my brush and make sort of a rough kind of shape. And if I want the hard edge, then I let that top part dry. But supposing I think, oh, that line is a little too stiff for me, then I can take a brush that just has water in it. And it'll start to sort of soften up a little. Like that. Okay. So this would be an example of putting wet paint onto a dry surface. Now, suppose I'd like to put wet paint onto a wet surface. This surface is still damp. This is the one that I just finished putting the background on, and it's still pretty wet. I mean, it's still pretty wet. So let's put some purple. And so the color sort of runs a little bit. Now if I want to make that more extreme, I can spray it with my brush and the color will, whoops, I'm getting color on the floor, which is really not something I want to do, so that's where my paper towel is kind of handy. I can turn the paper the other way and the colors will start sort of rolling and blending the other way. In fact, that's kind of cool. Let's play with that a little bit. So I'm going to put, I don't want that color. Let's try another, like a blue. Now this is still wet, and we're going to put some color, and you see how it runs together? Now maybe we would like to mix another color with that and see what happens. See how it spreads? So if the paper is wet and the surface is wet, then these things will spread and work together. And that's another technique called wet into wet. So you've seen wet into dry, and you've seen wet into wet. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of an example. This is the piece that you saw before that had the wet onto dry, and now I'm going to go back in and just playfully kind of play around with what could this be, right? Because I don't have anything in mind that I'm trying to make, but it sort of looks a little bit like an animal to me. So I can go back in with another color and start to add a little bit of detail. And I'm just playing around here. I don't really have an idea in mind. Actually, I sort of do. It kind of looked to me like a big old buffalo that was kind of galloping along. And so I'm going to add a little bit of detail here. Some hooves. And it's kind of crazy looking, I know, but that's okay. I think it's a good idea, you know, to just play around. You don't have to, nothing has to be serious when you start this. I mean, you know what you want to paint, so that'll be a little bit easier in your case. This is kind of crazy, I realize. But, you know, it's good to see a crazy example, I think. He didn't have a tail, so we better give him a tail. So, you know, if you know what you want to paint, that's one thing. But if you don't, you can still play around with all the shapes on the page and just see what shows up. Sometimes it can be sort of fun that way. Give this guy a little chin there. His back hoof doesn't really look that great. Okay. There. So there is a kind of crazy, wacky looking, I don't know that those are really ears. He probably needs a bigger ear, huh? So give him some bigger ears. There, that looks a little bit more buffalo-ish, I think. But it seems like his nostrils are a little bit too dark. So I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm just going to blot those a little bit. There, that looks better to me. So that's a little bit crazy, I realize, but supposing I wanted to make this into a scene, maybe I would just take some green and I'd pretend like I was, okay, so like up ahead there's some trees where he might be going. One of the things to think about with watercolor is that usually things are suggested rather than done in exquisite detail. So you give a sort of a hint of what it is you're trying to portray rather than trying to make it very, very specific like you would with a pen or an ink drawing or a pencil drawing. Now let's pretend there's a lake down here, so we put some water in. There we go. Okay, kind of crazy, but a little buffalo running towards some trees. So one last thing in your beginning watercolor tutorial is it can sort of be fun before you get too serious into your fish series to just do a bunch, just sort of practice playing around with things like backgrounds and making a bunch, kind of like I did in the demonstration. So I'm actually going to send you some of these for fun. That concludes our video tutorial in watercolor techniques. And I hope that you are going to have lots and lots of fun with this, and I look forward to seeing all the great things you produce. All right, till next time, bye!